What you're about to hear Beatty has done by turning 180 degrees away is turn himself into bait, and the Germans are following. And Beatty is running back towards his big fleet, which is coming up from also about 40 miles away. So now he's flipped the ambush once again. And now the Germans are heading toward the only fleet that is still invisible on this naval battlefield to anyone. The Germans don't know that the British Grand Fleet is up ahead of them. But now the British Grand Fleet knows that the Germans are coming. And Admiral Jellicoe, in a very brave move, I mean, he's operating without enough information. Once again, Admiral Beatty gets blamed for not giving him, good positional information or whatnot. But a lot of this falls into the category of it's a dress rehearsal to these guys. A lot of their errors are the kind of things they would have corrected if they'd had a chance to practice it in, combat situations. Unfortunately, these are a lot of, you wouldn't call them rookie mistakes, but you would correct these before the next battle. Nonetheless, Jellicoe takes a chance, deploys the entire British Grand Fleet, which, is more than 100 ships over 15, 20 square miles of ocean. It takes 15 to 20 minutes. That's how well-trained this fleet is. And he deploys the whole thing, and he's waiting for the Germans to arrive. And the Germans are now in the mist, right? This battlefield's very misty, and you'll run through fog banks, and you won't see things for a while, and the Germans can't see what's going on. And famously, Admiral Hipper, who's the German admiral in charge of the battle cruisers, radios Admiral Scheer, the head of the entire German Navy, who's with the German fleet here, and he famously looks off into the mist and tells Scheer, something lurks in that soup. We would do well not to thrust into it too deeply. Too late. The first thing that happens is the Germans start taking some fire, and they don't know from where, big guns, and then all of a sudden the mist parts for a second, and it's another British battlecruiser, the Invincible. And as soon as the mist parts and the Invincible becomes clear, it doesn't take 90 seconds before big German guns are opening fire, the shells pouring down on the Invincible, and like the other two battle cruisers, the Invincible explodes. So if anybody has forgotten in the intervening, hour or two since the earlier battlecruisers exploded, that this design is proving to be somewhat flawed, the explosion of the Invincible before the two main fleets collide is a historical reminder. Nonetheless, it's only soon after that the Germans emerge from the mist to find the entire deployed British fleet waiting for them in like a crescent around the horizon. And Scheer says the minute that they can see what's happening, the entire horizon erupts in a sheet of flame. These ships are a long way from each other, almost invisible to the naked eye, smudges up against the horizon. You see like the smoke of all these ships, and then you see like the flash of the guns, and just like lightning and thunder, where you see the lightning and then there's this delay and then the thunder arrives. Same thing, you see this flash and it's silent, and then boom, the boom hits you after the shells have already passed over. And there are destroyers in these battles. We haven't even talked about all the light ships running around, sort of parrying and like a bunch of little gnats between the battle fleet. And these destroyers sometimes describe what it's like when these giant shells pass over their heads, and they say they sound like locomotives when they screech over your little ship's head. But when they fall in front of your little ship, your little destroyer, they raise geysers of water, sometimes 100, sometimes 200 feet up into the air, and it's composed of tons of liquid, which then falls back down to earth. And these destroyers, these little ships, are sometimes beaten up pretty severely by all this water smashing back down into them. Some people are, splashed overboard and all these kinds of things. Nonetheless, Admiral Jellicoe has performed a famous naval maneuver that you never want to be on the receiving end of, called crossing the T, where he's formed the top crossbar of the T, and poor Scheer and the Germans form the vertical line of the T, and every one of the British ships can fire on the German ships individually as they come to the front of the line. It's a disaster. Very quickly, Scheer gets hit with more than 22 heavy shells fast, and within 10 minutes, Scheer has quite tactically, adroitly, by the way, turned his fleet around and disappeared back into the mist. And once again, without radar and all that kind of stuff, hard to know where he is at that point. And he sends out a bunch of light units and destroyers and whatnot to cover his escape, so the British can't just run after them. They might run into a bunch of torpedoes and mines and stuff. And then inexplicably, not too long after, the Scheer arrives back into visual range, and, people fire again. And then Scheer escapes again because he got his T crossed for a second time in one battle, which is almost unheard of. It shows you Jellicoe's a pretty darn good admiral. And then there's a little night action between the light units. But about this time, Admiral Scheer's had enough. You get your T crossed twice in one day, it's time to call it a battle, and Scheer and the Germans manage to limp home. When all is said and done, the British lose 3 battle cruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers, while 1 German battle cruiser, 1 pre-dreadnought battleship, 4 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers are sent to the bottom. The casualties at Jutland are not significant. They don't hurt either navy badly. The British learn their lesson about the battle cruiser design, but the Germans are humbled. They don't come out again in strength. There'll be a little encounter here and a little try there, but this is it. They gave it an attempt, and they seemed permanently shaken because of it. The German surface fleet will not perform another militarily significant move in the war. The only part of the German Navy that's going to be relevant for the rest of the war is the part that uses torpedoes to go after not military targets, but economic ones. By 1916, the economic side of this war is coming to the fore. We begin to see what war on this scale is like when it becomes part of the normal life of all of these countries. This isn't a new phenomenon anymore by 1916. By the middle of 1916, we've been doing this for 2 years, and it's been sucking up more and more of the energy of these nation-states that are involved in the conflict. It's very unlike the way most wars by these powers had been fought, where the civilian population might not even know a war is happening. If it was happening, they certainly weren't directly or importantly impacted. This war's different. First of all, it's life or death. The stakes are so high that everybody's involved, and the armies are requiring such immense amounts of stuff. The Germans will call this Materialschlacht, a war of material, that the entire civilian population and the production capacity of all these countries gets warped trying to provide it. As historian Gwen Dyer says, quote, "It is significant that the phrase home front came into use during World War I, when the role of munitions workers and of civilian production more generally was becoming as important to victory as the soldiers in the trenches. Without a constant flow of supplies equal to the vast consumption at the front, the soldiers would soon be helpless. And since the mobilization of so huge a number of men left vast gaps in the normal workforce, France had put 20% of its entire population into uniform, Germany 18%, and the other major powers not much less, the remaining adult civilians had to be directed by government into whatever jobs were needed to keep production going. In effect, the civilian economy," he writes, "was conscripted too. The governments of Europe quickly took control over labor and raw materials, imposed rationing on all scarce goods, and created true war economies. Women flooded into factories to replace the men at the front, and most production beyond the basic needs of subsistence was diverted into the war effort." End quote. Dyer is also the one that said by this time, quote, "Battles had become an industrial operation in reverse, in which the rates of destruction at the front matched the rates of production in the industries at home." End quote. I think of guys like the British military leader Haig, or even the German military leader, General Erich von Falkenhayn, And I think about all these skills that they're required to have now, above and beyond what you would think of as a normal general's skills. And you saw this in earlier wars. There's famous stories of General Sherman in the Civil War in the United States being extra qualified for modern warfare because of all these failed jobs in private industry he'd had that taught him all these lessons that no one knew a general would need in modern warfare, things about logistics and stuff like that. But by 1916, a guy like Haig, a cavalry commander, looks like he would be totally out of his element dealing with the modern production needs of warfare, as indeed he was. Falkenhayn's a bit more scientific of a guy. And he's, I always try to think if I were General Falkenhayn, if this were a war game, and I played a lot of those in my time, and I got assigned, because I don't think I would take Germany if I had a choice of which side of the war game I wanted to play. But let's say I get assigned Germany, and I command and play Germany in this war game, and I'm Falkenhayn. The estimates are, especially during this time period, that if you include the colonial subjects of the powers in Europe during this time period, my enemies in this war, if I'm Falkenhayn, have 750 million people they can call on, for their value and their effort and, in some cases, their lives. My side of the alliance has about 150 million. My enemies have the greatest fleet in the world, and I just learned at the Battle of Jutland that my navy can't come anywhere near touching them. And they've shut down all of my overseas trade. So if I'm General Falkenhayn already, I'm sitting here going, wow. Now you look at the lineup in terms of the kind of countries in each alliance, right? You have the British and the French and the Russians as the three big guys in the Allied Entente alliance. These are all first-rate powers. Best sea power, best land power, biggest power, all three together. Wow. And then they have a bunch of other countries like Italy and smaller powers. That's a very powerful force. Who do I have on my side? Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, basically. None of those powers are first rate. At least the Turks aren't asking me for help all the time if I'm Falkenhayn, though. They're putting on a pretty brave fight. They've managed to kick the British, French, South Africans, Indians, New Zealanders, and Australians out of Gallipoli in January 1916. That's unexpected. They've managed to beat the British forces, mostly Indian troops, in a place called Kut in modern-day Iraq, trapped them in a fortress there, forced them to surrender, and took them on a death march. But it really doesn't impact Falkenhayn very much one way or the other. It's just nice for him to know that the Turks are winning as opposed to losing, because they are losing against the Russians, but it's a mixed bag. Remember, the Turks are tough, but they are not quite a 20th century army. So that's gravy to Falkenhayn. The bigger problem if you're Falkenhayn is your close allies, the Austro-Hungarians. They're a pain in the rear. They don't listen to you to begin with. You're having fights with their main military leaders, and then they go do what they want anyway, and then they screw up because they didn't follow your advice, and then they come to you and say, will you bail us out? If you're Falkenhayn, they're a pain in the rear. And he's continually having to take scarce troops from places like Verdun, and instead, taking the train, sending them over east, and saving the Austro-Hungarians bacon. Can't really blame them, though. They're in big trouble anyway. They may not have been a country in 1920, even if there hadn't been a First World War. They're made up of 11 major ethnic groups in that state, some of whom don't want to be there. And their army is a microcosm of their state. And you've got troops who don't even want to be in your empire at times on the front line that you're asking to die for your empire. It's not a good situation. They're constantly getting into trouble, and as one German diplomat famously says about Germany's situation with Austria-Hungary, we are fettered to a corpse. We're tied to a dead guy. And that's the Austro-Hungarian force. Now, in your favor, if you're Falkenhayn, you probably have the best army in the world. The 1916 German army is fantastic. It's a combination of the best aspects of the 1914 force that Germany went to war with, but battle-hardened by experience. Here's the way writer Ian Passingham describes it, quote, "It is true that the German army on the Western Front by early 1916 was more skilled and better equipped for trench warfare than either the British or the French. This is not too surprising, he says, as the British Expeditionary Force had only just expanded its army from around 250,000 in 1914 to just over 1 million largely inexperienced men. And the French, he writes, had always been uncomfortable with the notion of defensive operations rather than the offensive spirit. He then says, quote, "Many of the German veterans of the inconclusive though bitter fighting at Ypres, Neuve-Chapelle, Artois, Champagne, and Loos in 1915 had survived and stiffened an army that had been well led at the sharp end and remained resolute against Allied efforts in the West. It had come close to beating the Russian armies on the Eastern Front in that year also. In short, as John Terrain has noted, it must never be forgotten that the German army of that period was very good indeed." End quote. So that's what you bring to the table. Is that enough? Is having the best army in the world enough? And by the way, that's something you traditionally think of when you think of the French. But it's safe to say, I think, that since about 1870, the Germans have the best army in the world. Will that compensate for all the downsides the Central Powers have? Hard to know. One of the worst is the fact that the left hand and the right hand don't know what each other are doing in the Central Powers. The Austrians go off the reservation all the time, don't tell anybody what they're doing, don't get any approval, don't work together with anyone. And it's a handicap, especially when the Allies/Entente forces are pretty darn good at this. They have an agreement that they made in 1915 to come to the aid of each other when hard pressed. When the Germans launch Verdun, within a month, the Russians come riding to the rescue in Lithuania, trying to help. They launch an offensive that they are clearly not ready for, and how could you be? That would be a very short time in this period to have planned and stocked up for and carried out an offensive. In March 1916, the Russians throw human wave attacks at the Germans and predictably get mowed down. The Germans, looking at the corpses, thought these people totally untrained cannon fodder, as though the Russians were willing to throw tons of human meat at the Germans simply to scare them enough so that they would pull some units out of Verdun and take some pressure off the French. It was so inept that some of the casualties the Russian soldiers suffered were because of being shelled by their own side's artillery, which is always a tragedy. And 12,000 Russian soldiers froze in one night. A lot of these were wounded, but a bunch were people that just, were out there in the cold without the proper stuff. The Russian logistics are traditionally pretty horrible, especially in this period. It shows you the nature of operations there. The Russians are not generally thought of as handling these sorts of things well. And in March 1916, they don't handle it well again. The worst part, probably from the Russian perspective, though, is they went to all that trouble and it didn't take any pressure off the French at Verdun. The follow-up effort, though, by the Russians on June 4th, 1916, will be handled much better, surprisingly well, if you're a guy like Falkenhayn, and you've written off with a lot of your other generals any chance the Russians have of doing anything significant in 1916. June 4th, 1916, the Russians do something very significant, led by their unquestionably best general in the First World War, a guy named Brusilov. We had mentioned in an earlier episode that the Russians simply couldn't attack. They were okay sometimes on the defense, but they couldn't attack. And the problem is always the same. They just have such an old-fashioned, not up-to-date logistics system that the farther you moved away from where you started, the harder it was to get the supplies necessary for a modern army to run. But Brusilov is the most modern commander the Russians have. He's been learning from fighting the best army in the world, the Germans, all this time. And even though he's a cavalry commander, and they have a reputation for always being sort of old-fashioned, Brusilov embraces the new systems out there and the new technology. For example, he does something almost no Russian army ever does in the First World War. He uses aircraft to help as spotters and to locate positions behind the lines and for reconnaissance. Right there, he's acting in a much more modern way than Russian armies do. Remember, we're talking about an army that for the entire length of the First World War will still be wearing cloth caps. They never get metal helmets during the duration of the First World War. So this is a very old-fashioned army. Brusilov takes what he can do that's modern and uses it. launches his famous offensive named after him on June 4th, and he does so with a very modern artillery barrage, intense but short. He's used all sorts of camouflage to hide his intentions. He went as far as painting fake trenches on the ground behind his lines to confuse the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians on the other side. And when he launches his attack, he does so along an enormous front. The Eastern Front's very different than the Western Front. Instead of being this really constrained, small area which they can build a wall from side to side real easily, it's a huge area, so it's much more thinly defended. And what Brusilov does is he attacks across this giant front with 500,000 men, intending to break upon the defenses of the Central Powers like a wave breaks on a breakwater. And knowing that in many places his forces will get pushed backwards, but where he meets weakness, they should burst through. Here's the way writer G.J. Meyer explains what happens on June 5th when, hours after the artillery bombardment starts, the 500,000 Russian forces step out of their trenches and move toward the mostly Austro-Hungarian lines, but there are German troops too. Quote, "His infantry, when it attacked on June 5th, found the Austrians in confusion. Its advance stunned them with its scope, extending as it did along a line of more than 250 miles. Brusilov's idea was that by attacking everywhere, he was sure to find holes somewhere, and he had moved his reserves, scant though they were, close enough to the front so that they could exploit opportunities as soon as any appeared." End quote. He continues, quote, "And the result was, from the first hour, a success of almost incredible magnitude. The Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army disintegrated when hit. 71,000 of its men, more than half the army, were killed, wounded, or captured. The Seventh was wrecked even more completely, losing 133,000 men. It was the same almost everywhere. After 3 days, Brusilov found himself in possession of 300,000 prisoners. Before the end of the week, more than half of the Austrian defenders had become casualties." End quote. Brusilov shattered the Austrians. And then he ran into the typical problem any Russian commander runs into, the inability of the Russian army and government to get him enough stuff fast enough for him to not slow down and have his offensive filter out. But this maneuver had a domino-like effect on the war, because at Verdun, Falkenhayn now had a crisis on his hands in the east, where he was going to have to pull troops out of Verdun to go save the Austro-Hungarian army, which was disintegrating. And let's understand, the Austro-Hungarian forces, we told you about those troops who were a microcosm of the empire as a whole who didn't want to be there. You had whole units, and I mean battalions, regiments of Slavs, throw down their weapons and surrender to the Russians, who, by the way, are Slavs too. Let us not forget that this war began when a Slavic national assassinated the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, right? And now we're asking Slavs to fight for that empire? Many of them threw down their weapons. They didn't want to die, and they certainly didn't want to die fighting for that empire. And they certainly didn't want to die fighting for that empire against their Slavic brethren. In fact, some of these units are said to have jumped into the trenches with the Russians, turned around, and trained their guns back on the side they had just defected from. The Germans will manage to contain, with their wonderful army, the Russian threat, and they will halt Brusilov's advance and even deal a defeat to the Russians. But already the single-minded focus of Falkenhayn on Verdun has been shattered. The Russians, who put in such a wonderful effort in the Brusilov offensive and did such terrible damage to the Austrians, suffered immensely, though, while doing so. Well over 1 million casualties suffered in the Brusilov offensive, which once again takes the Russians and begins to ratchet up the level of dissatisfaction, getting them closer and closer to the breaking point. You can almost feel it in the air in 1916. A couple of these major powers are within one good punch of going down. In the spring of 1916, French military leader Joseph Joffre tells his British counterpart that France is one of those nations. within a good shot of going down. Remember, by this time they've had a month or two at Verdun. The French have suffered like 200,000 casualties. And at least this early, 2 months into 10, but nobody knows it yet, at the Battle of Verdun, it looks like the German leader Falkenhayn's plan to bleed the French army white is working. It's why you can't take your eyes off the First World War. They're like two prize fighters. And just when you think one guy's taking over the fight, the other guy lands a good shot and somebody's knees buckle. And in the spring of 1916, Joffre tells Sir Douglas Haig, the current commander of British forces, that it's France whose knees have been buckled. And he urges Haig to start that summer offensive that he's been planning for a long time on the River Somme early. He says if you don't start it early, the French army will cease to exist. He gets so worked up, we're told, that he can only be consoled and calmed down with lots of 1840 brandy, from the year 1840. Joffre needed good brandy to calm down. Nonetheless, Haig speeds up the big offensive planned for the summer of 1916, discussed with all the other allies in late 1915. This is a long-term plan, and Haig's going to launch it early. This long-term plan results in the most controversial piece from the British standpoint of this whole war, maybe of British military history in its entirety. First of all, Douglas Haig, you have to understand that the field marshal that Joffre's talking to is the new guy. Just like most of the great powers in the First World War, by 1916, they've fired the person that got them into this mess, right? The war's terrible. Everybody's, predictions were wrong. Nobody's fighting it well. So one by one, all these countries are sacking the people that got them into this mess. The Russians dropped theirs. The Germans have Falkenhayn because they got rid of von Moltke while the war was, in its early phases. The French still have Joffre, crazily enough. But, that reputation of the miracle of the Marne in 1914 will only carry you so far. He doesn't have long to go either. And the British in late 1915 sack Sir John French, like we told you in the last episode. The guy who gets his gig is a guy named Douglas Haig. He'll be a field marshal. He's another one of these cavalry commanders. It's always weird. We have a war where cavalry becomes something that you keep off to the side and don't use because it just gets killed. And the horses are more important to move stuff. Because crazily enough, and we haven't talked enough about this, and we'll get to it, horses are everywhere. There's millions of them in this war. And they're casualties too, by the way. But all these cavalry commanders, French, Haig, all these guys have these visions that we're going to break the German line somewhere, and then the cavalry's going to go rushing in the hole we create and go into the back, and it's the Wehrmacht armor blitzkrieg version of that. That's a strategy that's been used throughout history, right? Goes back to, pre-Alexander times. Smash the cavalry into the hole and roll up the lines. It's blitzkrieg before you have motor vehicles, and that's what these cavalry commanders are still dreaming of 2 years into the war, that puts the final nail into the coffin to the idea that this cavalry has any offensive role to play. Although you have to remember, it still is the fastest moving thing on the battlefield in large numbers. You're starting to get motor vehicles, but, tough for the motor vehicles to handle terrain, and they're very unreliable. Horses are still the fastest mobility you have, so they're valuable just for that point alone. They're very vulnerable, though, and the stories of dead horses and the suffering of animals in the story is under-discussed. Nonetheless, Douglas Haig, the new British cavalry commander, has at his disposal some of the largest, really the largest armies that Britain has ever had ready to go to war. Because those volunteers that started joining when Lord Horatio Kitchener, you'll remember, the British military leader from the beginning of the war, the guy who, when you see his picture, screams 19th century man. With a giant mustache from another era. You can almost see him in a British red coat, and he's the big face on the recruiting poster telling patriotic Britons to sign up for king and country and a shilling. And Kitchener's another one of these pre-war, early war generals and military leaders who's been tarred by, their conduct in the war. They don't end up looking so genius-like when the First World War gets done with you, right? So as Kitchener's reputation is starting to wane, he's still got one real feather in his cap, and that's that those armies that he helped recruit in 1914 and 1915, and that he has protected like a proud parent. Don't send them to Gallipoli. Don't send them to the Western Front early. Don't throw them in the meat grinder like everything else. Save them and really make use of their patriotic contribution. These people want to win the war. Let's put them in a position where they can do that. He's done an admirable job of that. And about 3 weeks before, those soldiers, known sometimes as the Kitchener armies or the Kitchener divisions after him, are going to lose the guy that was probably most responsible for seeing that they weren't used up already in the first place. Kitchener dies about 3 weeks before his legions are thrown into the fray. It's a crazy story. I'm told that it is the same as any one of those big modern deaths, so the same as a Princess Lady Diana dying, or a Winston Churchill dying, or JFK dying in the United States. You say to yourself, do you remember when that happened in Britons of the period? Remember where they were when they heard that Lord Horatio Kitchener, British military leader and almost demigod at the beginning of the war, has gone down at sea. On a warship on the way to Russia on some military mission. And the boat goes down at night in a force 9 gale after hitting a mine. And there are survivors who say, take this with a grain of salt, that they saw Kitchener on the deck as the ship went down, impassively sort of accepting his fate and just standing on the deck as the ship goes, beneath the waves. That really works with that whole 19th century military leader reputation, doesn't it? Nonetheless, there have been conspiracy theories ever since about this. Believe it or not, it's one of the great conspiracy fountainheads to come out of the First World War. Nonetheless, it meant that 3 weeks later, when Kitchener's, parentally preserved armies are finally thrown into the fray, he's not there to have any say in it. The guy who is Douglas Haig, the new guy, now known to some in history as the Butcher. So that should give you an idea of what we're about to get into here on a wide variety of fronts. This battle is one that Sir Douglas Haig has been preparing for since the year before. When the French told him that they were in danger of disintegrating, he's moving up something he's been working on for a while now, and everyone knows it. The big 1916 offensive is no secret. Heck, it's in newspapers, basically. I mean, when you find out all the ways that everybody knew this was coming, it makes you wonder right again how intelligent it is to be launching something that everybody knows is coming. But it couldn't really be helped. If you're going to fight at this spot on the Somme River where the British and the French forces meet on the Western Front, where the British line ends and the French line begins, that's where they're going to hold this joint offensive. Maybe for the sole reason that that's where both armies are. A really silly reason to attack the greatest defenses on the Western Front, which are the greatest defenses ever in the world right now. These are defenses that make the old Roman, lines that you would cross Europe with these giant minor. There's never been defenses like this. The Germans are at the point now where they're building creature comforts into their fortified line. I mean, they're putting wallpaper on, and they've got electric lights and ventilation and, running water. I mean, it's crazy. The trenches are in some cases all lined with wood boards, done with about as much thoroughness as the Germans are known for. These are huge, modern fortifications in some sense, and these Germans on the other side of this line, where the French and the British are thinking about launching this big 1916 offensive, have bunkers that are 30 and 40 feet underground, cut into the chalk of these hills that the Germans occupy. They're looking down for months as the British load up all the stuff you now need for a modern offensive. All that stuff we said that the Germans needed at Verdun, the British need at the Somme, right? The French too, by the way. They've laid 5 railroad lines, new tracks to the battlefield, because that's how often and how many trains are going to be running, just unloading stuff for months. 3 million shells, millions of tons of food. I mean, crazy amount. Engineering corps that are building things, full-on permanent structures, while the Germans watch the whole thing and plan for it and train for it. They're having drills every day. How quickly can we get up from our underground bunker and get up to the trench and man the machine guns before the British soldiers are on top of us, right? Everybody knows this is coming, and everybody knows how it's going to be fought. The British take these armies with many, many, many green troops that have never been in a battle, puts them in the trenches opposite these German lines. Again, a position so strong that Winston Churchill says, It was, quote, undoubtedly the strongest and most perfectly defended position in the world, end quote, and starts bombarding it with artillery. Starts June 24, 1916, early, by the way. A lot of artillery. As a matter of fact, the Somme becomes one of about 4 or 5 First World War battles that compete for, like, the Guinness Book of World Records for the biggest, largest, worst, more intense, most numerous, category artillery bombardment of the war. There, as a history geek, I would be arguing it with my other history geek friends, and it's always about criteria, right? Are we talking about the largest number of shells fought throughout an entire battle? 40 or 60 million ever done, maybe? Or are we talking about the most number of shells used in the initial part of the battle? Or the most number of shells dropped in the shortest period of time? Or the smallest space? I mean, there's literally a measurement of how many tons of shells fell on each square meter of these battlefields. And by the way, if you use that as your criterion, Verdun is the worst artillery bombardment in history. Nonetheless, the fact that the Somme is in this argument shows you the level of artillery we're talking about here. And when it opens up on the 24th, it's incredible in its volume, but the Germans laugh a little. I mean, it's a huge bombardment. But the Germans are mostly underground and undercover, and most of the bombardment is, once again, shrapnel shells. Sounds like a little teeny point, doesn't it? A battle to turn on. But had those shells been high explosive instead, or maybe even gas, this battle may go another direction. And every historian brings up that the shrapnel was pretty much pointless. Remember, it's like a giant hand grenade or shotgun shell exploding in the air, and all these little pellets hit the ground. It's devastating to infantry out in the open, but the Germans aren't in the open, right? In addition, the artillery is meant to do more than just kill Germans. The artillery has to clear the battlefield of all this stuff that's there as defenses so that the troops on the British side can actually get to the German trenches. It's full of barbed wire. No man's land, another trench, then another no man's land, then another trench. The trenches are all going uphill, and these no man's land areas, besides being filled with concrete bunkers and everything we told you about before, the killing zones, they have yards of barbed wire, as thick as your finger. It's a physical impediment. It has to be overcome by the generals. The generals have figured out in their minds that an artillery barrage of this, caliber, the amounts we're talking about here, the barbed wire will just explode in pieces. It will not be an impediment when the artillery barrage is over, except that shrapnel shells will be effective. Now, there was a benefit to the artillery barrage, though. As we've quoted before, Napoleon has this great line that comes in handy all the time, that quantity has a quality all its own. And the sheer intensity of this barrage began to have an effect on the Germans, even though they were physically protected from being, injured by it. It began to play on them. First of all, they know they've got something really nasty awaiting them in their future. You have to try to put yourself in their shoes, okay? They know that when this artillery barrage is over, the British are going to be on them. They've been training for this moment for months, right? Run up the stairs. How quickly can you get, in front of the machine gun in time to stop the British from taking over your trench? So they're going to either be killed, be grievously wounded, see a friend killed or wounded, or have to kill somebody. They're going to have a really nasty day in their very near future. In the meantime, you're going to have one of the greatest artillery barrages in history going on around you. Ernst Jünger, who will be at this battlefield in about a month, and see an artillery barrage that is not as bad as this one. He will compare it to the roar of the ocean. He will say that there are no individual sounds. And he says it will achieve at times and last for hours a demented intensity. That he says when it eventually calms down to mere drum fire, which is, the sound of a drum roll. That's how fast the artillery shells are dropping. And he says even when it's the drum roll, you can't pick out any individual explosions. It's just one big loud sound. But the demented fury that it reaches sometimes blows that away, literally. And that's the kind of intensity these soldiers are living with, knowing that they've got this horrible moment in their future, and it goes on for days. And we're told that the German soldiers who were kind of laughing at the fact that the British were using like 70% shrapnel shells on them aren't laughing anymore. They're getting tired and stressed. You put yourself in the position of just not sleeping for 5 days. And now, add all the other things on top of that. So there is an effect that this artillery is having, and the Germans all right about it. The British commanders, this is part of the controversy. We're told that there were lots of people saying that this artillery barrage was going to make this a cakewalk. And you've heard that before, right? Don't all these battles begin to sound alike? Isn't there a repetitiveness to this story? If there is, you're getting the right feeling of it, because that's how, it's always been played. And it seems like the people at the time felt too, oh no, not again. Haven't we seen this movie before? The generals seem to always just want more stuff. Give us more artillery, give us more men, give us deeper defenses. We'll fix this situation. So here's the biggest artillery barrage the British have ever launched. They shoot off 2 million shells in no time. And just for comparison purposes, 100 years before this time, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon is estimated to have had about 20,000 cannonballs with the French army. So, 2 million shells in a week or two versus 20,000. It's crazy the level of artillery we'll see here. And it lulls the commanders into this sense that it's going to accomplish so much more than it does. It's the soldiers on the ground, though, that produce the, historical reminders that most of them were too realistic and too savvy and too cynical to buy into any of that rosy thinking. The generals could afford to be rosy. The guys on the ground going in, for example, the first wave of this assault that the Germans have been waiting for you for months, they know better. And you can tell because there are absolutely heartbreaking last letters home that have made it into the history books. Peter Hart's wonderful book on the Great War has one of these letters from a Captain Charles May, who fights in the 22nd Manchester Regiment. And he's writing to his wife right before he goes over the top in this battle. And again, imagine how it affects you to be in the position of writing a letter like this. I always think that's a permanent scar on your soul, even if you get the proverbial reprieve from the governor, right? From Captain Charles May, 22nd Manchester Regiment, who's about to go over the top on the first day of the Somme, and writes his wife, quote, "I must not allow myself to dwell on the personal. There's no room for it here. Also, it is demoralizing. But I do not want to die. Not that I mind for myself. If it be that I am to go, I'm ready. But the thought that I may never see you, or our darling baby again, turns my bowels to water. I cannot think of it with even the semblance of equanimity. My one consolation is the happiness that's been ours. Also, my conscience is clear that I've always tried to make life a joy to you. I know at least that if I go, you will not want. That is something. But it is the thought that we may be cut off from one another which is so terrible, and that our babe may grow up without my knowing her and without her knowing me. It's difficult to face. And I know your life without me would be a dull blank, yet you must never let it become wholly so. For to you will be left the greatest charge in all the world, the upbringing of our baby. God bless that child. She's the hope of life to me. My darling, au revoir. It may be that you will only have to read these lines as ones of passing interest. On the other hand, they may well be my last message to you. If they are, know through all your life that I loved you and baby with all my heart and soul, and that you two sweet things were just all the world to me. I pray God I may do my duty, for I know that whatever that may entail, you would not have it otherwise." End quote. And Peter Hart, with remarkable sensitivity, adds a postscript that says, quote, "Charles May, the loving husband of Bessie May and father to his baby Pauline, would indeed be killed the next day. He is buried in the Danzig Alley British Cemetery. Small-scale tragedies litter the history of war, sad reminders that the necessities of war ruin the lives of heroes." It's as we said, all this pain from this world are like pebbles dropped in water, and the ripples outward affect the rest of these societies. When you have millions of people impacted like this, the ripple effect affects tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of people. For a while, the Somme becomes one of these pebbles that's like ground zero for a huge ripple effect that will affect Britain to this day. I try to think about what mental state I would be in after writing a letter like that. And when you think about millions of people, young people mostly, being in situations where they're writing a letter like that, how does that change you? I mean, there are going to be noticeable changes in this generation of people in the 4 years during this First World War. I've been comparing this period to a historical estuary, right, where one generation and another generation sort of mingle, the old world and the new world. But maybe it's more of a wormhole through time. And when this 19th century group of people, transitions through to the 20th century, it's not going to make it intact. It's going to suffer damage on the way through. It's like a birthing process to the modern era, and that can be bloody and painful and potentially fatal too. The British have thought throughout this war that they've taken large casualties. Battles of 1915, places like Gallipoli, those are large casualties for the British, which are a traditionally naval power and employ relatively, by continental standards, small armies. This is the first time they've had a large enough army to suffer the kind of casualties that some nations like the French or the Germans or the Russians have been suffering this whole time. On July 1st, 1916, the shelling subsides, the whistles blow, and these troops in the morning are told to get out of their trenches and head across into no man's land and continue to take the German defenses. And this is where they find out that the assumptions made in the planning stages of this conflict haven't come to pass the way the military experts assumed they would. And because of that, British forces, on the very first day of the Battle of the Somme, will suffer 60,000 casualties. 20,000. There's never been a day like it in British history. And now all of a sudden, they can understand how the French felt. On that August day in 1914, when they suffered 22,000 dead in an afternoon. These are thoroughly modern casualties, and to people not accustomed to them, they are stunning. And the fingers start pointing immediately. What the heck happened? A generation of people who felt this viscerally have kept this debate going, and it continues between historians even today. What the hell happened? Who's responsible for this? What happened to the troops? Well, they got out of the trenches only to find that in most areas, the assumption that this artillery would smash up the wire wasn't true, and the wire was there. There was a physical impediment in no man's land, trapping troops in the open so they could be raked by machine gun fire, artillery fire too, but mainly machine gun fire, from those Germans who were not as badly affected by the artillery either as the planners had assumed they would be. Tens of thousands of British soldiers are being mowed down all the time. One German on the other side of this human tragedy at the Battle of the Somme on the first day is quoted in Ian Passingham's book, All the Kaiser's Men. And he says, quote, "The leading wave of British troops was now halfway across no man's land. Get ready was passed along our front, and heads appeared over each shell crater edge as final positions were taken up for the best view, and machine guns mounted firmly in place. A moment later, when the first British line was within 100 yards, the rattle of machine gun and rifle fire broke out along our whole line of shell holes, followed soon after by deadly accurate shell fire. The advance rapidly crumpled under this hail of shell and bullets. All along the line, men could be seen throwing up their arms and collapsing, never to move again. The extended lines, though badly shaken and with many gaps, now came on all the faster. Instead of a leisurely walk, they covered the ground in short rushes at the double, and within a few minutes the leading troops had advanced to within a stone's throw of our front trench. Again and again, the extended lines of British infantry broke against the German defense like waves against a cliff, only to be beaten back. It was an amazing spectacle of unexampled gallantry, courage, and bulldog determination on both sides." End quote. Now, those are the troops who made it through the wire. There were places where gaps had been blown in the wire. The problem was the troops would congregate at those gaps because they're the only way to the other side, and then get stuck in giant backups as a small stream of troops made it through the corridor, and those backups and those globs of soldiers just waiting for their chance to get through the corridor of the wire would be mowed down by shell fire and machine gun fire. This day has so affected the British. In fact, it's their version of Verdun. What Verdun is to the French soul, the Somme is to the British one, and it has divided historians ever since. And you can see normally calm and sedate, rather cold sometimes, British historians lose their head over this subject. mean, John Keegan, who I've said is not my favorite, but the two world wars I think are his strong point. And you can tell he's a guy who's hung out with some of the enlisted troops that were trapped that day at the Somme, because their continued anger and incredulity about this whole thing has rubbed off on him. And by the way, if you were trapped there like a sitting duck on, an open plain in no man's land, watching your buddies get blown to bits and you're freaking out, you would be thinking too, who the hell put me here? Who's responsible for this? If I ever get out of this, heads will roll. And of course, most of these British troops at this battle are not of a class in British society that could have made much of a fuss, but they've got loyal defenders who will when this is over. Keegan's one of them, by the way. You can just feel the anger when he writes, quote, "In all, the British had lost about 60,000, of whom 21,000 had been killed, most in the first hour of the attack, perhaps the first minutes.